All right, welcome, folks, as we continue in our verse-by-verse journey through the Gospel of Mark. We're in week number 21, and we're picking it up in Mark chapter 10. Mark chapter 10, starting at verse 1. Controversial, often discussed passage in the Gospel of Mark. Let's again get context, because it seems a little bit out of place initially when you understand the bigger context. Maybe it'll make more sense. So, as we like to begin, we're talking about many scholars break the Gospel of Mark up into three acts. Acts 1, 2, and 3. And we said Act 1, the theme is, who is this man? And for the first several chapters, Jesus is sort of building his credentials. He's building his resume as the Messiah by doing and saying authoritative things. So who is this man? Well, he's the Messiah. And the hinge is there at Caesarea Philippi, where Peter says, Jesus says, who do people say that I am? They list off a bunch of options. But who do you say I am? You're the Christ. And Jesus said, you're right. I am the Messiah. And then that takes us to Act 2. And the theme of Act 2 is, who is the Messiah? Because Jesus is saying, okay, yes, I'm the Messiah, but the Messiah isn't who you think he is. I'm not some political superman who's going to overthrow those dirty Romans and set up Israel's political kingdom. That's not what the Messiah is. And so now we're in the midst of Jesus unpacking what the Messiah and who the Messiah truly is. And if you remember, we said that Jesus in this Act 2, and the journey, by the way, from geographically, the way Mark has it is the Sea of Galilee, Dead Sea, Mediterranean. Caesarea Philippi was up here, and really the journey Mark has us going on now for all of Act 2 leading to Act 3 is he goes down to Capernaum, and then Jesus heads down. And here's a bit of a confusion. We're not sure where he goes here, but he ends up eventually down back in Jerusalem, and that's where Act 3 takes place. Jesus' last week in Jerusalem. So Act 1 is Jesus traveling all over. Act 2, Mark has Jesus traveling down to Jerusalem, and Act 3 all happens in the last week of Jesus' life. So we're now journeying south from Capernaum down, heading towards Jerusalem today. And remember, we learned that there's three cycles that Jesus goes through as Mark depicts it, where Jesus makes a prediction. He predicts his passion, meaning his suffering. He predicts his suffering and his death. And then each time the disciples, a poor reaction, we'll call it. There's a really bad reaction where first time Peter hears it, he says, no, I'll never let that happen to you. Second time, as we just went through a week or two ago, was the disciples arguing about who would be the greatest once Jesus brought about his kingdom. And each time then after that, and there's a third one that's about to come up in a week or two. But each time, so there'd be a prediction, a disciples' poor reaction, and then Jesus would use it as a teaching moment. And that's where we are today. We're sort of still concluding Jesus' teaching moment from his second passion prediction as he's heading down to Jerusalem. And so, as we pick it up, chapter 10, verse 1, it says, Jesus then left that place, and when that place meaning north, up Capernaum likely, I believe, and he head into the region of Judea and across the Jordan. Again, crowds of people came to him, and as was his custom, he taught them. So, Jesus leads them south from Capernaum down in Judea. Let me tidy this up a bit. Go back to our map. Because this is a little confusing for scholars, what's going on here. So if you've got Sea of Galilee, Jordan River, Dead Sea, Jerusalem's about here. Capernaum's about here. And so it says that he went south, left that place, and went into the region of Judea. Okay, well, Judea is here. Okay? And he went into the region of Judea and across the Jordan. Okay, well, across the Jordan is what was called Perea. This is Judea. Think of these as provinces almost. But Perea wasn't even part of Israel. So it says he went into Judea and across the Jordan. Why this was a little confusing is they weren't sure. If Jesus took the common route, then he would have done this. Down here, and then, because this was Samaria, where the Samaritans were, the typical Jews didn't want to walk through Samaria. They didn't like Samaritans. So Jesus would have walked Trans-Jordan on the other side of the Jordan, and then he would have crossed at Jericho, and then climbed up to Jerusalem. But Mark says he went down, I'm going to get his words, he went into the region of Judea, so he has him going here, and then across the Jordan, and then he goes back, which would be odd. Not unheard of, but it would be odd, and it appears that that's probably what Jesus did. So he goes down here, and he dips over into Perea, this area, and then he makes his way back over into Judea. Now, why does this matter? Why are we even choking on this little gnat here? Because, as your outline says, this isn't a blank, but number 2A, this factoid sets up a key insight into what is about to happen next. Mark is setting us up as readers. He's filling us in on the context. The area where Mark places Jesus is the area of Perea, the region of Perea. Why does this matter? This is huge to understand this. 2 reasons. Because it matters because of the man who is in charge of Perea, and it matters because of the man who was imprisoned and many believe was killed in Perea. The man who was in charge of Judea and Perea was none other than Herod Antipas, and whose wife was the infamous Herodias. Herod Antipas was the guy and who was imprisoned in Perea and many believe killed in Malchus, the prison here, John the Baptist. Some of you are connecting the dots. Jesus has gone down and now he's made his way into Perea, the territory of John the Baptist, the territory territory of Herod Antipas, and the territory where John the Baptist was imprisoned and many believe where he was killed. And that is our context. Read verse 2. Some Pharisees came and tested him by asking, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife?" These Pharisees were slimy. Do you see what they're doing? You're in the territory of Herod Antipas. You know, the guy who just chopped the head off John the Baptist for critiquing Herod and Herodias' marriage, and because Herodias divorced her husband. Let me ask you, Jesus, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? What's your view on divorce in this region of Perea? Slimy. You can see what they're trying to do here. And it says they were testing him. Verse 2, some Pharisees came and tested him by asking, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife?" As your outline says, number 1, the Pharisees tried setting another trap. These Pharisees tried setting another trap. How so? Well, 1A on your outline. They were trying to get Jesus to pick a side in a religious debate. They were trying to get Jesus to pick a side in a religious debate. Understand this. In first century Judaism, there was general agreement that divorce was allowable. It was allowed. That really wasn't the issue. It was not really up for debate for the most part whether divorce was allowed. It was not a concern. However, what was debated back then was the grounds for divorce, meaning not if a person could divorce, but when divorce was allowed. That's where the debate was. Think in these two in this way. And today, there's debate in Christian circles when it comes to whether or not a person can lose their salvation. Once you're saved, are you always saved, or can you lose your salvation? And those two schools of thought are based upon a rally around the names of two different Christian leaders over the years. There's Calvinism, based upon John Calvin, and then there's Arminianism, based upon the teaching of Jacob Arminius. And so there's Calvinism, and there's Arminianism. And two different schools of thought views about whether or not a person can lose their salvation. Well, essentially, back in the first century, there were two main schools of thought in Judaism regarding what were legitimate grounds that a man could have to divorce his wife, because women couldn't divorce their husbands in Judaism. We'll get to that in a moment. And these two schools of thought in Judaism were represented by two rabbis, two names of rabbis, Rabbi Hillel and Rabbi Shammai. So just like there was Calvinism, there was Hillelism and Shammaiism, okay? And you were in one of those schools of thought, okay? So, by the way, as I said, in Judaism, only the husband could divorce his wife. There were no provisions for a wife to divorce her husband in Judaism. That was part of the scandal surrounding Herodias divorcing her husband to marry Herod. Part of the scandal was her husband was Herod's brother, but another portion of the scandal was that a woman divorced her husband. You couldn't do that in Judaism. Whether that was right or wrong is another issue. Jesus allowed for women to divorce their husbands, but again, we're getting way ahead of ourselves. But Roman law allowed you to do that. So clearly Herodias must have done this appealing to Roman law, which have infuriated the Jewish people that much more. So for a first century Jew, a man could divorce his wife, but the debate was surrounding the grounds for such a thing. And the two schools of thought were represented by the names of two rabbis, Hillel and Shammai. So what were these two schools of thought? Well, as your outline says, Rabbi Hillel taught a liberal view. Rabbi Hillel would have been a liberal, progressive in this area. He taught the liberal view. And his view was represented by Matthew's record of the question in Matthew 19:3. Matthew records a little bit more of what happened here, a little fuller. Or if the Pharisees didn't say this, Matthew was giving the context. Here's what they were saying. Here's what they were meaning, okay? In Matthew's version of this, it says, Matthew 19:2, I'll start. Large crowds followed Jesus, and he healed them there. Some Pharisees came to him to test him. They asked, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? That was the teaching of Hillel. Hillel taught that a man could divorce his wife for any and every reason. As you can imagine, this was the more popular view amongst Hebrew men, okay? But did any and every reason really mean any and every reason? Like if she burnt the supper? Yes, literally. One rabbi wrote from that time, if your wife does not accept your control, divorce her and send her away. Josephus, the famous Roman Jewish historian, he wrote this in his Antiquities. He says, he that desires to be divorced from his wife for any cause whatsoever, as many such causes happen among men, let him in writing give assurance that he will never use her as his wife anymore, for by this means she may be at liberty to marry another husband, although before this bill of divorce be given, she is not permitted to do so. So Josephus was saying, and he himself had used this provision. Another rabbi back then wrote this, if your wife burnt the food, you can divorce her. Yet another rabbi said, if you found someone that was more pleasing to you, you can divorce your wife. This was the most common and popular view amongst first century Jewish men, Hillel. Secondly, Rabbi Shammai taught a conservative view. Shammai taught a conservative view, and his view was only in the case of adultery can a man divorce his wife. Now, as you can imagine, Shammai was not as popular amongst Jewish men. So, the Pharisees, they ask, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? And Matthew fills out the context a bit more. Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? Are you of the school of Hillel or the school of Shammai? Okay? Now, as your outline says, letter B, they were trying to drag Jesus into a political trap. They were trying to drag Jesus into a political trap. Remember where they are. They're south, across the border. They're in Perea, Herod Antipas's territory. Herodias, who was rabidly protective about anybody's opinion about what she did. And Mark specified that they asked Jesus this question to test him. They wanted to set up some political tripwires regarding Herod and Herodias. And they also wanted to set up some popularity tripwires amongst the common man in that area. They wanted Jesus to have to say, because they were assuming he'll be more conservative. Jesus is conservative. So he's not going to say yeah for any and every reason. He's going to go with Shammai. And then the rest of the crowd who love Jesus are going to say, whoa, time out. What? You said what? And they're hoping again to turn the crowds against Jesus. So they're setting traps up here. They anticipated Jesus would be ultra-conservative on this matter, and they wanted to expose that. Okay? Very political. So Jesus' first response, we pick it up in verse 3. Jesus responds, well, what did Moses command you? He replied. As your outline says, Jesus appears to be turning the tables and testing them. With that question, Jesus is turning the tables and he's testing them. You say, well, how so? Because Jesus knew that no such command existed. There is no command in the Bible from Moses about divorce, per se. Okay? So why would Jesus then ask this question? It appears that Jesus is testing them. He's setting them up to have to say, well, there is no command from Moses concerning grounds for divorce. There is no command. We'll get to the one portion in Deuteronomy in a second. But there is no command from Moses concerning grounds for divorce, per se. He's trying to get them to acknowledge and realize that God never commanded divorce, but that God at best permitted divorce as a concession to sinful activity in the hearts and lives of people. As your outline says, letter B, to be, or not to be, yeah, it's to be. They were treating Moses' teaching as if it was a command they were obeying, when it was actually a concession by God in light of human depravity. Jesus is exposing something. They were teaching divorce as though they're obeying a command by divorcing, when in fact it was really a concession by God in the light of human depravity. It wasn't something God commanded, it's something that God allowed because of sin. So Jesus asks a question that he knows the answer to. He's a good lawyer. As a lawyer, you never ask a question you don't know the answer to in court. I mean, you're taught that. And so here's the Pharisees' response, verse 4. They said, Moses permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce and send her away. They're quoting here from Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 to 4. Let me read it. This is the only portion of Scripture that teaches on divorce outside of the New Testament. Here it is. If a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent about her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her, and sends her from his house, and if after she leaves his house she becomes the wife of another man, and her second husband dislikes her and writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her, and sends her from his house, or if he dies, then her first husband who divorced her is not allowed to marry her again, and after she has been defiled. That would be detestable in the eyes of the Lord. Don't bring sin upon the land the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. Now, as your outline says, the passage neither mandates nor sets out legitimate grounds for divorce. That passage we read neither mandates nor sets out legitimate grounds for divorce. It talks about when you can remarry. It doesn't set out legitimate grounds for divorce. Letter C, that passage was to forbid a husband from remarrying a woman after he's divorced her, she's remarried, and divorced again. That's what that passage teaches, and that's all that passage teaches. Now, why? What's up with that passage? The reason for this prohibition in the Old Testament are uncertain, but it may involve, and again, we need to remember that we're looking back through centuries of a whole completely different cultures and legal systems and so on. But the reason may involve, as your outline says, preventing the exploitation of the woman or using her for a money grab for another man's inheritance. Or I could say to Jan, okay, listen, Jan, here's what we're going to do. Calvin Weber is loaded with money. He's a multimillionaire. Ministry does it. And so, what I want you to do is, I'm going to divorce you. You marry Calvin, and then spit in his face. And that way, when he divorces you, you will get some of his income. And then I'll marry you again, and we suddenly got rich. And Scripture says, no, can't do that. You can't play that game. You're using that woman for your own gain. Scholars think that might be one of the reasons why this is happening, but we're not for sure certain the reason for that prohibition in Deuteronomy. Okay, so then Jesus responds to this. So that they've cited this qualification that Moses gave, not a command, just saying, here's what happens, here's one instance how you can't remarry after a divorce has happened. It's not taught on divorce per se, not given grounds for divorce, just said if that divorce happens and then there's a remarriage and then a divorce again, here's what you can't do. That's all that teaches. And that's it in Scripture. Here's Jesus teaching on divorce. We pick it up in verse 5 of chapter 10. Jesus said, "It was because your hearts were hard that Moses wrote you this law," Jesus replied. "But at the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man will leave," quoting now the Old Testament, "for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate." When they were in the house again, the disciples asked Jesus about this. He answered, "Anyone who divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another man, she commits adultery." Wow. What's he saying here? Well, as your outline says, 4a, divorce is a response to the hardness of human hearts. Divorce, according to Jesus, is a response to the hardness of human hearts. He said, he did this because your hearts were hard. That phrase is always used in the Bible in the context of stubborn resistance to God, insensitivity to God's kingdom purposes, resulting in obedience to or maybe even outright rejection of God. That's always the context of that phrase. Often in marriage, in fact, 99% of marriage ceremonies that I do, the couple asks for, or I include, Paul's definition of love in Corinthians, 1 Corinthians 13, the love chapter, agape love. And it always ends, Paul ends there by saying, love never fails. And I often, at that moment in the wedding ceremony, say, now you may be here and you're thinking to yourself, well, I know of instances where love has failed. And I say, no, I respectfully disagree. You don't know of an instance where love has failed. You know of an instance where people have failed to love. Love never fails. And this is what Jesus is saying here. That's a hard saying, as they say, but Jesus is trying to be very clear here. Here's words never heard in the office of a divorce lawyer. We both loved each other faithfully and unconditionally, and things just fell apart. That's never been said in the office of a divorce lawyer. We continually loved each other faithfully and unconditionally, and things fell apart. No, that's not true. That would never happen when we love each other faithfully and unconditionally. Biblically speaking, and again, this is hard truths here, and this is why that's why the disciples pulled Jesus aside afterward and said, "What did you just say?" Biblically speaking, divorce is never good. Biblically speaking, divorce is never right. But it is sometimes necessary because of the fallenness of human nature. Sometimes divorce is necessary to prevent further harm. Yet it was never God's intention for marriage. Never. That's what Jesus is trying to get across here. And Jesus needed to declare this because at that time they were treating divorce as something that was just a normal part of life. And Jesus was shocking them back into reality. One New Testament scholar I read put it this way, I quote him. He said, Jesus' statement was recognizing that any broken marriage, Jesus was recognizing any broken marriage for what it is. It's a breaking of God's standard. And Jesus was portraying any provision for divorce, not as good, but as a regrettable concession. And then the scholar went on to say, modern society shows us what can happen when a provision for damage limitation comes to be regarded as a right or a norm. Think about what he just said there. Modern society shows us what can happen when a provision for damage limitation, something created to limit damage, when we start to regard that as a right or a norm. What's he saying? Well, think of like a welfare assistance. Welfare assistance was never intended to be the option. I can either have a job or I can have welfare. That was never the intention. Welfare, rightly so, was intended to never be a normal lifestyle. It was intended and designed to limit the damage during the emergency or crisis situation in a person's life. A way to keep you going until you can get a job. It's a good thing. But it's never designed to be, well, you can work or you can go on welfare. Which will I choose? And divorce was treated that way. Think of it this way. Painkillers. Painkillers were never, opioids were never intended for normal, casual, everyday use. But they were intended and designed for limiting damage during a crisis situation. But when we treat them as just something we can do every day, that's when it brings damage. And that's exactly why divorce was permitted. Not as a casual, normal, healthy lifestyle choice, but as an emergency response to limit the damage that sin has caused in a relationship. In other words, if there's a husband who's abusing a wife, and if there was no such thing as divorce, that woman would be subject to that man's battering and abuse for the rest of her life. Because of human depravity, God says, I permit that woman to have a divorce. Not because divorce is good. It's never good. But because that's better than her being damaged for the rest of her life. So to limit the damage, I permit divorce. Never my design, never my intention, but as a concession to the sinfulness of humanity. That's what Jesus is getting at here. So Jesus takes them back to the very beginning, to God's initial design. That's an old rabbinic, a Jewish rabbi debating technique. It's called the older, the weightier. Meaning, if you quote Moses, I'll quote Abraham. Abraham's older than Moses, so I win. The older, the weightier. They're quoting Moses in Deuteronomy, so Jesus says, let me take you back to Genesis. Let's go back to the very beginning. Beat that. And he quotes from the beginning, verse 6 to 9. At the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. As your outline says, what Jesus is teaching here is marriage is designed to be a heterosexual, monogamous union for life. I'll write that all out for you. You're welcome. Heterosexual, monogamous, that's an A, monogamous, union for life. That's what Jesus just taught us. Heterosexual, monogamous, meaning one man, one woman. This means male, female. This means not polygamy, but monogamy, just one. Mono is one. Okay, monogamous union for life. How do we get that? Well, it says there, at the beginning of creation, as your outline, that's God's initial design right there. So this is God's initial design. At the beginning of creation, this is God's initial design. B1 is what that is. And then B2, God made them male and female. That's heterosexual right there. That's where we get heterosexual. God made them male and female. This is God's initial design, according to Jesus. Heterosexual. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife. That's monogamous. A man will leave his father and mother. So this radically overthrows any previous social relationship. This social relationship replaces the obligation I have to my parents. I now leave my father and mother, and I'm united to my wife, okay? And the two will become one flesh, so they are no longer two, but one flesh. That is union. That's where we get the union. When and how this happens is uncertain. This two becoming one flesh. Is that the sexual union? Is that the union before God? Jesus, Scripture does not say. I think it's a combination of the two myself. But Jesus implies that this union is very real. What was two is now one. Jesus said. And therefore, Jesus said, what God has joined together, let no one separate. That's where we get lifelong, or for life. Lifelong. Marriage, according to Jesus in Scripture, is designed to be a heterosexual, monogamous union for life. This is God's design, and this is God's doing, according to Jesus. So for anyone, Jesus said, to separate such a union is to work against God. And working against God is not good, or normal, or healthy. It's sin. Now, admittedly, it is sometimes necessary to divorce. It's sometimes the lesser of two evils, as we pointed out a moment ago. But it's sin nonetheless. Sin that's done in response to a prior sin. And Jesus is forcing the people to face this reality. Stop treating divorce like it's good and wonderful and noble. It's not. It's a sign of the presence of sin. And folks, nobody knows this more than people who've experienced divorce. Letter C. Jesus has gone strongly countercultural, and it has thrown the disciples for a loop. Jesus has gone strongly countercultural here, and it throws the disciples for a loop. Verse 10. When they were talking about the disciples, when they were in the house again, the disciples asked Jesus about this. What were you talking about out there? Like, you've gone way countercultural here. Letter D. Counteracting the casual way they were treating divorce, Jesus repositions it as the product and a producer of sin. Jesus repositions divorce as a product of sin and actually a producer of sin. Divorce is the product of a previous sin, and it actually produces more sin initially. How so? Look what he says, a radical statement here, verse 11 and 12. He answered, anyone who divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another man, she commits adultery. He's saying, when we divorce and remarry, by the way, Matthew softens that a bit in his version. He adds, except for marital unfaithfulness. He says, this is true unless your spouse has been maritally unfaithful. But Matthew seems to be trying to soften it, but in the end, he ultimately doesn't change it, as we'll discuss in a moment. When we divorce and remarry, Jesus says, and the two, by the way, were assumed to be linked in Judaism. Divorce without remarriage was not truly divorce. For a Jewish man, you divorced so you could remarry. You didn't divorce to live a single life for the rest of your life. Divorce and remarriage were one and the same. Jesus is saying, when we divorce and remarry, this is not a clean break. It's not as though, okay, there, now my hands are clean. No, he's saying no one's hands are clean. Everyone is guilty and everyone's a victim. Everyone, he's saying. Jesus says, remarrying places you in the position of committing adultery against your former spouse. This was against your former wife is actually what he says here, which was a radical statement for Jesus to make, since it was considered only adultery against the husband in first century. You weren't committing adultery against your wife. The wife was committing adultery against the husband. It was very male-dominated. And so Jesus, when he says this, what are you talking about, committing adultery against your wife? What? So Jesus, again, his equality of the sexes was radical. Now, there's a level of hyperbole here, but exaggeration to make a point, but Jesus is trying to make a point. The implication is not that your next marriage is one continuous adulterous affair. Jesus is not saying, if you divorce your wife and then you remarry again, for the rest of your life you're an adulterer and you're living in an adulterous relationship. He's not saying that. He's saying that your initial sexual encounter on your honeymoon, we'll say, even in the context of your second marriage, that initial honeymoon encounter is an adulterous act when you understand that your first marriage was heterosexual monogamous union for life. And so you have broken that vow that you made by having a sexual relationship outside of that. That initial act was not pure and wonderful and innocent. It's actually, in God's eyes, an adulterous act. Because you broke a previous vow, whom God has joined together, let no one separate. And when that is separated, even if it's necessary, it's not good, it's not wonderful, it's necessary, But let's not celebrate it and think that it's a sinless thing. It's not sinless. Both parties in that first marriage are sinners, and both parties are victims. That's what Jesus is saying. This is sobering stuff. And that's why the disciples were so rattled. We've had divorce in my own family. I get it. I understand the pain and the reasons. I had a very good friend for many years, and he was in one of the congregations I was pastoring, and he was well, I won't say anything more, other than he was on his second marriage, and in fact, his wife was one of my staff members, his second wife. And godly man, godly couple. And him and I would golf frequently together on Fridays. And as we were golfing, I remember talking to him one day and afterwards having lunch together. I said, so Brian, tell me a bit about your first wife, your first marriage. What happened? And he just began to choke up and weep, and he could never, ever talk to me about it. He was so broken and wounded by what happened. And he had a beautiful wife now and beautiful family. And like I say, his wife was an incredible woman and on my staff. And we were great friends. But the pain, he understood what Jesus is talking about. Nobody understands the brokenness of divorce more than divorced people. And this is what Jesus is saying. Face it. Be honest about it. It's not good. Sometimes necessary, but it's never good. And they just couldn't fathom this. So look at how Matthew records the response. Matthew 19, verse 10. Says, the disciples afterwards, he fills it in a bit more. The disciples said to him, if this is the situation between a husband and a wife, it's better not to marry. They're saying, Jesus, if you can't divorce someone for any and every reason, why get married? Do you see the mindset they had? If I can't throw away this relationship, then I'd better not get married in the first place. If you're saying I'm marrying someone for life, whoa, that's a big decision. Jesus is saying, yep, exactly. That's the point. That's what marriage is. Look at Jesus' response. He doesn't bite their bait. So they're saying, oh, woe is us. If this is the way it is, then it's better not to marry. What does Jesus say? Not everyone can accept this word, but only those to whom it's been given. For there are eunuchs, these are people without genitalia, who were born that way, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by others. And there are those who choose to live like eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. The one who can accept this should accept it. Jesus is saying, yeah, you're right. If you're not willing to be married for life, it's better for you not to be divorced. Now, some people don't get married because they have no sexual desire or ability, and some are made that way, some are born that way. And some choose to live single for the rest of their lives for the kingdom, good for them, but if you can't handle this, so be it. They didn't get any, yeah, well, this is the ideal, but you don't have to do this. No, Jesus said, yeah, you're right. You got it, guys. If you can't handle it, don't get married. It's awfully quiet in here. Awfully. So let's have some fundamental conclusions before we open it up for, we probably won't have time for questions today. Before we open it up for questions. Here we go. Some fundamental conclusions. Marriage is always sacred. That's what Jesus is teaching here. Marriage is always sacred. There's no such thing as a starter marriage. There's no such thing as a throwaway marriage. Marriage is always sacred. S-A-C-R-E-D. Sacred, meaning holy, set apart. 2, divorce is always tragic. Always. Nobody knows that more than people who've gone through it. And we're not condemning anyone here. We understand. We're teaching what Jesus said. And number 3, divorce is always the product of mutual human sinfulness. Divorce is always the product. It's never always one person. It's always the product of mutual human sinfulness. It's because we're fallen creatures. I am not sinless, neither are you, neither is my spouse. All right, let's open it up for questions about today's teaching. The question was, I have a friend who loved his wife, was faithful to her, but she was unfaithful to him, and it wasn't his fault, something she did. He was not sinful in the marriage, you're saying. And you believe that. I know that's what your friend tells you, and you believe that. He was faithful to her sexually, but that's only one part of the story, isn't it? All I can say is from someone who's pastored for decades now and sat through a lot of sessions with couples who stayed together, couples who broke up, there's no such thing as a completely innocent. I've never had a spouse say to me, Pastor Darren, I had nothing to do with this. If your friend was honest, and he's your friend, so I know he would be, or she would be. If it was just you and them sitting across and you would say to them, Susie, Joe, look me in the eye. Do you see how you maybe contributed to some level of drift? I'm not blaming you for what ultimately happened. Your spouse is accountable for their choices. But do you see it in any way that you allowed a drift to take place? That you maybe didn't meet all the needs that your spouse needed from you? I'm sure in their heart of hearts they would say, yeah, I'm not sinless in this. I'm not saying it's 50-50. So I'm glad that you brought this up. I'm not saying it's 50-50, but I'm saying for sure it's not 100-0. Great question. You have a friend who's going through this, and the Bible talks about how to heal, how to recover. Actually, the next 2 weeks at Broadway Church, in our God's Guide for Getting Along series, we're going to be touching on some of this. Next week, we're going to be learning about God's Guide for Family Relationships, how to have a healthy family. And in 2 weeks, we'll be talking about God's Guide for Marital Relationships. And I'm going to be talking about the needs of a husband, the needs of a wife, and the role of a husband and the role of a wife. And let me give you this. The best book that I've ever read on this subject, and I refer it to people all the time, is, what's it called? Thank you. His Needs, Her Needs. How to Affair-Proof Your Marriage. His Needs, Her Needs. How to Affair-Proof Your Marriage. And this, it's a Christian book, and through marriage counseling with hundreds, thousands of couples, they came up with the top 5 needs of a husband, top 5 needs of a wife. And it's my job to meet my wife's top needs and her job to meet my top needs. By the way, just off the top of your head, go with your gut here. What do you think is the number 1 need of a husband? Just say it. Sex, that's right. The number 1 need of a wife? Affection. Affection. Which is not sex, men. It leads to sex if you're good at it. But it's not the same thing. So, and then, wives have other needs, including financials and stability, and men have other needs, like a playful partner, and he needs her to be proud of him, so on and so forth. We may touch on this in a couple weeks in that sermon, we'll see. But if it's my job to find out my wife's top needs and do everything I can to meet those needs. And if you do that, think of these needs as hunger pangs. And that's why I come back to your friend. If I am meeting my spouse's needs, then she shouldn't be hungry to be met other places. And sometimes emotional needs spill over into physical needs. And that affair isn't about physical sex. It's about the thrill of being needed and desired and so on. So anyway, but we're getting into counseling at this point. But that would be a great place to start right there. Next week, it's communion next Sunday. And then the following Sunday, we're in our new format. It'll still be here. Following Sunday, the first Sunday in April, during all 3 morning services in this room, there'll be tables set up, and this class will be taught during all 3 of those services. And I'll be teaching them live midweek, and they'll be recorded and shown here. Is how it'll all play out, but you'll see as that happens. So just know that the first Sunday in April, this class will be available during the 9 a.m., 10:30, and noon service in this room. God bless you.